I'm really happy to introduce to you our keynote speaker that was part of the plenary session just before the parallel sessions that you attended. I am very honored to have Dr. Savo Heleta with us here as a keynote speaker. He has very extensive experience in the field looking at higher education across the globe and in conflict and post-conflict settings, trying to look at the different dynamics of support to higher education, but also looking at many other different structures, as we were able to sort of discuss in the plenary structures, power dynamic structures of hierarchic knowledge exchange, etc. Savo holds a PhD in development studies and master's degree in conflict transformation and management from Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University, also BA in history and business management from St. John's University, Minnesota in US. He has a very long portfolio of experience and skills, but he's a very humble person, so I see he's already nodding to me, please don't go over all of that, but I would like to mention that he has done extensive research in the field and also published very much so on different areas of conflict management, universities being part of peace building, social justice advocacy and activism, his research interests really range from decolonialization of knowledge to higher education, internationalization, and various areas in between in post-war settings, foreign aid that I mentioned, and conflict analysis. Being a researcher, he's also working with internationalization as a scholar and practitioner, educator, analyst, and author, and has more than 10 years of experience in higher education in South Africa. But also he has published, he's an author of a book, Not My Turn to Die, Memories from Broken Childhood in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Savo, the floor is yours.
Thank you all for being here. It's been a long week, but I think it's been very, very engaging. What I'm going to do now, I'll try to talk to you and just share with you some of the work that I've been doing for the past just over a year. And just for the introduction, Juliet, you are the only person here that also attended in 2023 at the University of Sussex, the peer network symposium on higher education in conflict settings and higher education in peace building. And I gave a keynote at that symposium, and at that time we're talking about similar things, and we were also hearing from many people from different conflict settings, and talking about higher education, the challenges, the possibilities, and all the different things. And I remember when I was doing this keynote, so I've done a lot of work and research on higher education in conflict settings before, and I've read the work of other people, and for a very long period of time, until now, when we talk about neglect of higher education in conflict settings, especially when it comes to rebuilding, reconstruction, supporting universities and other higher education institutions, but we are not able to quantify or visualize this neglect. What does it mean? Like when we talk about foreign aid, what is available to universities? What is available to countries? When you know what I mean? Like when we talk about neglect, what does that look like? And at that time, when I was talking about it in Sussex, we had to rely on different data sets that are more broadly looking at higher education in developing countries. And out of that, and then if some of the other research would tell us that higher education is neglected in developing countries, and particularly also in low-income countries. So we're trying to kind of connect the dots and say, well, it's also applicable to conflict settings, but nobody has done any research. And it was after that event in Sussex that I had an opportunity to work with colleagues from Qatar, and we got research funding, and we got the opportunity to kind of think, what do we need to look at more broadly about higher education, about education in conflict settings. And so I got the idea that we need to try and figure out if we can do specific research on higher education in conflict settings, but specifically in terms of the aid flows to higher education conflict settings so that we finally get some idea, get some sense of what is happening. So I'm going to talk about this here, and I'm sorry that other people didn't have PowerPoints in their keynotes, but I have a lot of visuals, and there's no way I can explain them to you if I don't show them to you. And I think they're far more powerful and useful if we look at them. We know the picture on the left. We have seen it in the poster. On the right side is the also recent, last year's, destruction of just 2 universities out of many in Gaza. And but this is also not the full picture. There are other universities, there are other places, Sudan, university libraries, campuses have been destroyed, and so, we could just unfortunately, keep adding images after images from different settings. And I think I wanted to put this here because it really illustrates the problem and why we need to think about this. This whole week we've been talking about the role of higher education in peace building, and it's a key question. It's a really key question. We need to ask ourselves, what is the role, what the role can be, what else do we need to do to improve the role, what do we need to change, how do we need to change perhaps our institutions, ourselves, what else do we need to do with the students, and all that. But I think if we are expecting universities or higher education systems to have a role in peace building, a positive role in peace building, societal recovery, all that needs to happen in a post-conflict setting, or even, having higher education institutions as positive actors in a conflict setting. We also need to talk about the state of higher education in these societies, in these settings. And when it comes to the places like Ukraine or Gaza, where higher education is destroyed, where institutions are destroyed, we then need to talk about, how do we support or how do we mobilize support for these settings and for the institutions and for higher education systems to be rebuilt so they can actually contribute positively to socioeconomic recovery, peace building, state building, reconciliation, and everything else. So this is where this talk is framed, and it's built on the research that I've been doing, and I'm going to show you that in a moment. We had actual examples from people from Ukraine here, and there were some people also from Palestine who are appearing remotely, virtually, and they spoke about these real experiences of higher education institutions, of academics and the students, and the suffering that goes with, conflict, destruction, displacement, academics and students being killed, and everything else. And these are immediate challenges, but these also challenges go on for many years and many decades after the conflicts end. There's a lot of research that has been done over the years that looks at this. I'm saying a lot of research, but it's actually not a lot of research. It's kind of like, you can pack a small room with the people who are doing research on this. And that's also a problem. And I'm going to talk about this towards the end. I don't know if any of you have read the York Accord on supporting and rebuilding higher education after conflict. I'm not going to judge you. It's okay. But I think, again, that shows that we have documents about this. But those documents have been there now for a decade. We have to ask questions about the impact that those documents have had. We have to ask questions about, do we need to revisit them? Do we need to get more people involved in thinking perhaps on kind of like building on those documents. They're very good. I mean, your accord is a very good document that looks at, it could be very useful for people in Ukraine and in Gaza and in Sudan to think about what do we do? How do we support, number one? How do we support our institutions? How do we protect our institutions? And how do we mobilize domestic and international support for rebuilding? Higher education and this has been discussion this whole week, can play a very important role on many levels. Of course, skills development, capacity building, production of new knowledge and research, development of intercultural competencies, but also, we develop skills among our students, and so they go on to be, part of the economy to help develop and build society and everything else. But the key is, and this is what I was talking about in the beginning, what the literature and what our experiences are telling us over the years is that higher education has been neglected, grossly neglected in many ways in conflict settings. And again, the research up until now has been talking about neglect without necessarily knowing exactly what do we mean by neglect. Can we look at the numbers? If you're talking about foreign aid and neglect of higher education in conflict settings, what are the amounts? Because we need to know the numbers. It's like if we don't budget in our personal lives, if we just let money go in and out and we have no idea what the numbers are telling us, we're going to have a problem at some point. We're not going to be able to plan properly. And the same goes when it comes to rebuilding higher education or supporting higher education destroyed in conflict. I spoke about this, earlier, that, in the research that I was doing with my colleague, we found one study from 2005 done by the World Bank that looked at a period of time. The study looked at the provision of aid to different levels of education in 21 conflict settings at that time, and that study found that only 12% of World Bank's funding was going towards higher education. The majority was going, for basic and secondary education. So that's the only study that's been looking at these numbers. But that study was also only looking at the funding from the World Bank. So the large majority of funding that comes from bilateral donors and other multilateral donors was not included in this study at all. And so this is what we try to do. And I have to tell you, so I come from the qualitative background in my research and my, all my postgraduate studies, and then I wanted to rely on other people's interpretations of data to write about this, and I was never happy enough because they weren't asking the questions that I wanted to ask. I'm not saying they were not asking relevant questions, but they were looking at it in different ways for different purposes, and so I had to go and learn all this by myself. Working with the data, working with all this information and trying to make sense of it and trying to then, process it and analyze it and all that. So what we did was we used the data from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And, the most important thing is that this is open access data that's been there for decades. We just weren't looking at this. Anybody can look at this. And they still, the work we have done is just opening one small little window in terms of what we need to know. We need to know so much more. And I'm hoping we and everybody else will want to look at this. The data is very comprehensive. You have data for many years. You can look at decades. We looked at only the decade, the past decade that is available. So, the data is available until 2022. That's one of the limitations because you don't know what's happening for the past 3 years, past 2 years actually, because we're only now starting in 2025. But, when it becomes available, we can look at it in more detail. We were very careful in terms of selecting countries in our sample. So we looked at like 4 different data sets to really get to the countries that were, during this time period, either countries in conflict or countries in the post-conflict stage, kind of immediate post-conflict stage. We looked at the 3 types of donors. So the dominant donors in the world for quite some long period of time have been the Development Assistance Committee countries, which are the Western countries. So Europe, North America, Canada. Canada is part of North America, sorry about that. Australia. So basically, Western countries, they provide a large majority of aid, but they're not the only donors. So in the recent years, they are the so-called non-DAC countries, and those are the countries such as Turkey, such as Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and a number of other countries as well. And we have multilateral organizations. So we look at the data for all these different donor groupings, but also what the data set allows us to do. And this data comes from the countries themselves. So OECD, through Development Assistance Committee, requires these Development Assistance Committee countries to report the data aid flows to OECD. Multilateral organizations also have to report to OECD, and the non-DAC countries do it on a voluntary basis. So that's another limitation also, because the reporting by these emerging donors started only about in 2019, kind of consistently. So that's another thing that we need to look at. But the way that they report the aid flows to higher education specifically, and we can look at aid flows to like any different sector. We can look at the basic education, we can look at secondary education. We were interested in higher education only. And the aid flows to higher education, there are 2 types of aid. Aid to local systems and institutions. So aid that will go to the countries, that will get to the universities in the recipient countries, and also scholarship aid for citizens of countries that are in conflict to study in donor countries. And I'll talk about it in a moment, what that means and all that. But the most important thing, I guess, before I get into the data itself, is that this distinction between the 2 types of aid is very important, because only the aid to local higher education systems and institutions reaches recipient countries. Scholarship aid never gets, so for example, scholarship aid to Ukraine never gets to Ukraine. It's specifically used to pay for tuition and living expenses of Ukrainian students. For example, if Germany gives scholarship aid to Ukrainian students, all that money is spent in Germany, unless Ukrainians take some pocket money and send it home. But that's a different story. So that's a key distinction, because even though all this is then grouped under aid to higher education, I'll show you in a moment how much of that aid to higher education actually gets to the countries that need funding for rebuilding and strengthening their systems and institutions. I'm not going to go into too much detail about our theoretical framework, but the theory of targeted development through the provision of foreign aid is a very useful theory, and this theory basically speaks about foreign aid being used by countries who provide aid to get as much as they can, to achieve their strategic, geopolitical, security, economic, and other interests. And specifically in terms of targeted development, this theory looks at it, so basically countries that provide aid to specific countries or regions where they have specific interests. And when it comes to countries, for example, in conflict, again, it is about the interests of the donors that come into place. And so even when it comes to, they either support countries that are in close proximity. And the theory of development, of targeted development, also speaks about how, when it comes to conflict, migration, instability, and all kinds of problems that are happening in some parts of the world, in order to prevent those problems coming to us, developed countries, we provide aid to stabilize those regions in order to prevent problems coming in. When it comes to migration, we might provide some aid to stabilize the situations with the migrants coming in as well. So we talk about this in a lot of detail, but it's a very appropriate theoretical lens, in order to try and make sense of what types of aid are provided, out of these 23 countries, who gets aid, who doesn't get aid, and how do we make sense of, some countries getting aid and others not getting aid, while you could arguably, you can show that the needs are even greater in some of the countries that don't get aid. And that's another actually research project we've been working on over the past few months as well. So, okay, I just need some water. So this is one of our papers where we looked at 23 countries, 23 conflict-affected countries, and these are the aid flows or trends in the provision of aid from all three types of donors: DAC, non-DAC, and multilateral donors, split by the two types of aid: scholarship aid and then aid to local higher education systems and institutions. This is the period from 2013 to 2022. What do we see? What's the dominant type of aid? It's the scholarship aid. If you look at the orange, that's the aid that actually reaches these 23 countries year after year after year. And the key things that you can see here are that the scholarship aid was kind of stable. It was significantly more in between 2013 to 2017, 2018, and then jumped significantly. We don't see nowhere near similar growth in aid to local higher education systems and institutions. So immediately we can see that the donors are interested primarily in the provision of scholarships. And there's a lot of literature on scholarship aid and the issues and the challenges around scholarship aid, and the fact that scholarship aid is not about supporting systems and institutions. It's about individual benefits, provision of access to individuals who otherwise might not be able to study, which in itself is it's not an issue. That's not a problem. I mean, I would never go to university if I didn't get scholarship to study in the United States. I'm one of those. Well, it wasn't official development assistance. It was a private foundation offering us assistance, and so it's very important. But if we are thinking about rebuilding higher education in conflict settings, in places where universities, like in the picture that we saw earlier, that require assistance, scholarship aid never gets to those countries. Another thing that I just forgot to mention earlier is that the data that we use here is official development assistance. There are other types of aid that could be used to support universities and provide scholarships to individuals, like private donations, private foundations, corporations, and all that. That's not included in this because this is the government-to-government, basically, funding that is provided, and that's how it is. So that's another limitation, and there are more sources of funding that could be out there. But with all other sources of data, we have to rely on what we have. This is the list of countries that we looked at. So this can show you the countries that we've been looking at, but it can also show you the inequalities in the provision of aid by the three types of donors. Number one, between how some countries get the majority of aid while others are so far at the bottom. Arguably, the needs could be, that's another research project to do, compare this with the needs in these societies, in these countries, thinking about the destruction, everything else that happens. But this figure can also show, it shows you, the types of aid to higher education that these countries are receiving. So while Syria and Ukraine are on top, if we look at it only in the sense of aid to local higher education, Syria and Ukraine are not on top. And you can see the huge discrepancies in terms of what types of aid countries are getting. So Ukraine has received, during this time period, more than $1 billion in aid to higher education. But, 90% of the money never got to Ukraine. It did benefit Ukrainians, and quite possibly, people over this week have been talking about brain drain and all the different problems that come with displacement and, people leaving and possibly never coming back and all that. So yeah, and in the paper we talk a lot about this and what we're seeing, what we're not seeing. We unpack it in a lot of detail, and I don't have time for all that. But these are the things that we were able to find looking, systematically through this data set. This is another way to look at it. So here, I'm showing you only the aid to local higher education. So this doesn't include scholarship aid at all. What this shows you is a few things. So I just highlighted 3 countries that kind of come out on top. The previous graph shows you the inequalities in the provision of aid and how the majority of the countries are not getting really much of the aid. Here, in the case of Afghanistan, you can see how Afghanistan was the top recipient for a very long time in terms of aid to local higher education. But you can also see that happened only on 2 or 3 occasions, 3 years out of this 10-year period. And you can see how the aid almost disappeared long before the Taliban came to power. And you can we need to then perhaps work more on this and engage with the donors and others, people who are making these decisions. Why did local higher education why did donors give up on it? And it's a very important question. You can see Ukraine, that for most of the decade, donors were not interested to support Ukrainian higher education, not at all. And then, and literally, in the data, we can pinpoint that it was one multilateral organization that makes up most of that spike going up. And I'm not sure, it will be very interesting to see, what happened in 2023, 2024, whether more aid is coming to Ukraine. And it will be very interesting to hear from colleagues from Ukraine, whether you see this, is the funding that you get from donors sufficient for your needs? And that's a very important question. But you can also see that most of the countries get very, very little. And, if you think about, what are these amounts? We're talking about significantly less than 10 million for a country annually to support local higher education. I'll talk in a moment what that means when we put all these numbers together. I'm not going to spend too much time here, but what we did also was to unpack the data by the 3 types of donors and the 2 types of aid provided by the donors. And so when I said earlier that the majority of aid comes from Western countries, those are the DAC countries. You can see that in blue, they provide basically almost all of their aid in scholarships. And it's very interesting because, I know sometimes I just, I say things now that will come later in the slides because I know what's in there, but it's fine. Actually, I'll keep it for later. Keep it, it's like the movie, I'm not going to give everything now. So this graph we also unpack in a lot more detail, but you can see the different types of donors and different types of aid. One important thing to mention is that DAC and non-DAC donors are very similar in terms of the types of aid that they provide. There was a hope at some point that these emerging donors are going to offer something different, an alternative to the established Western donors. But in the case of higher education, we're not seeing that. Emerging donors, in terms of the types of aid that they provide, are very, very similar to the Western donors. they provide the majority of their aid in scholarships. They're not providing much, if anything, in terms of the aid to local higher education. Multilateral organizations are different. The majority of their aid goes to the countries and their systems and institutions. And, the theory of targeted development actually speaks about that the bilateral donors have their specific interests, priorities, strategic concerns, and everything else. Multilateral organizations are a bit more, they're different. They don't have that national priority thinking. Of course, they can be influenced by powerful countries, but they seem to have a very different approach to the provision of aid. But the problem is that multilateral organizations provide fairly small amount of aid overall to higher education. So that research looked at 23 countries. We tried to make sense of what is happening, where things are going. We also did work specifically on higher education in Palestine. And here we took actually a significantly longer time period. We looked at 2 decades of aid to higher education in Palestine from 2002 to 2022. And this has been part of the work that I'm doing with colleagues from Qatar and also Gaza and some other places as well. We're trying to think about the possibilities and the challenges that will come with rebuilding of higher education in Gaza when that is possible. And to think about what may be possible in Gaza, we needed to also try and make sense of what happened before. What are the trends in aid to higher education to Palestine? What can we actually say in terms of what happened in Gaza in the previous conflicts and all the different things in order to see whether the donors were there when aid was needed, which types of donors, which specific countries or multilateral organizations were there to support and all that. So we did, this comprehensive research, which should be published early next week. And what we found is very similar to what we found in the previous research looking at the 23 countries. The majority of aid to Palestine since 2005, actually since 2009, has been in the form of scholarships for Palestinians to study abroad. Significantly less of funding has been provided to the institutions, higher education system and institutions in the West Bank and Gaza. And specifically in our research, we then also say, okay, so what? There've been wars in Gaza since 2008, 2009, end of 2008, early 2009. So specifically, we look at the war in 2008, 2009, when the war and the Israeli bombings destroyed many institutions in Gaza, and estimated rebuilding was estimated, the cost of rebuilding was estimated at $25 million. In 2014, the estimated cost of rebuilding was $16 million. So we then look at this data and the trends in aid to higher education to see did those needs and priorities for rebuilding register among the donors, and we don't see it. We don't see it at all. We see that basically higher education was not prioritized, but the complexities in Palestine are different from other settings. Palestine is under Israeli occupation, Gaza is under occupation and under siege, and a lot of literature over the years looking at rebuilding Gaza after previous conflicts speaks about the restrictions imposed by Israel on aid getting into Gaza. So it's either restrictions on funding or restrictions on materials getting into Gaza. So we don't know whether the donors were interested to support rebuilding higher education in Gaza, but they couldn't get funding to do that. And that then led us to another research project. This is what I do, We always have more questions. Every time we do something, we have additional questions. And then we said, okay, is it really the case that the donors wanted to help but couldn't? Because since 1994, Israel has veto power in terms of any type of aid getting to Palestine, particularly getting to Gaza. So Israel can just say no, that funding is not going. And billions of US dollars couldn't reach Gaza since 2009 because of that veto power. So then what we did, and this is something that to our knowledge is the first time that's done in the case of higher education, research on higher education and aid to higher education. So the OECD data set also allows us to separate or to look at foreign aid commitments and disbursements. So foreign aid commitments, donors make a written commitment in terms of the aid that they're going to provide to a country or any of the countries that they provide aid to. So, for example, the donors will make for whatever, they make their plans, how much they're going to provide to Palestine, how much they're going to provide to Ukraine, and the commitments are basically written commitments that should be implemented unless something drastic happens. And then we look at the disbursements when the donors report at the end of that year how much money they actually provided for this specific sector. So what we did in this research, we engaged with the literature on the research on commitments and disbursements and unpredictability of foreign aid and all kinds of other things. But all that has been done, looking at, economic development and all that, but hardly anybody has done it in the case of higher education. Like, what do we say about, commitments versus disbursements in the case of higher education? So then we did this in the case of Palestine because we wanted to see, is it really that, donors want to help and provide aid to higher education, but they're not able to do that because Israel has restrictions. So what we found is that the neglect of higher education in Palestine over these 2 decades has been by design. It's the choice of the donors not to offer any significant aid, and particularly if you think about the conflicts before, and the 25 million needed in after 2009 and 16 million after 2014, that was never committed, nowhere near. And another important thing to mention when it comes to Palestine is that we have specific needs that we talk about in the case of Gaza, but this aid that you see here in yellow, that's not just for Gaza, that's for Gaza and the West Bank. And if you cut this in half, and because of the restrictions and the political disagreements between the government in West Bank and the government in Gaza, significantly less than half of the aid to higher education that gets to Palestine, that gets in the West Bank, is able to reach Gaza. So whatever we see here, it's less than half that actually gets to the universities and higher education institutions in the Gaza Strip. So when we ask that question, is higher education supported in Gaza, in Palestine? No. Is it linked to the needs? No. Is the sector neglected? Absolutely. And this is what our research, and we've been engaging with the Palestinian colleagues on all this, and it was very important to see that, of course, this research has limitations, like the data sets have limitations and everything else. But it was very important to see that we have a kind of like a starting point to think about aid to higher education in this specific setting, to start to think about what may be possible. Another thing that you can see here, so a bit of a spike since 2019 in the case of aid to local higher education is primarily due to Turkey and Qatar providing additional aid to higher education in Palestine, because the Western donors, since Trump 1 administration, have completely disappeared. So the US decided to cut most aid to Palestine, including aid to higher education. Europeans just followed the US. And now we see the breakup coming in that marriage. And we'll see what that's going to do. But it's been very interesting. So what we also see in the case of Palestine is the emergence of these new donors who, without them, there'll be very little. There would literally be no aid. And that, I think, tells us what may be happening, hopefully, if this ceasefire holds and the conflict ends and rebuilding can begin. We haven't done this research, but we have the data. And I wanted to, because we have colleagues here from Ukraine, this has been the picture in the case of Ukraine since 2010. And again, it's actually more extreme than the broader trends for those 23 countries. The large majority of aid to higher education in Ukraine is in the scholarships. And the main donor providing scholarship aid to Ukraine, like many other places in the world, is Germany. And Germany, on one side, has this policy to provide scholarship aid. And they talk all the nice talk, we do it to help people and provide access and all that. Next to that policy is a policy to keep graduates when they finish, international graduates, once they finish, because they need labor force in Germany to help Germany and German economy. It's not about other countries. It's not about solidarity. It's not about support or anything else. I'm not sure where the orange part of this graph is going to go. But if you think about that destroyed university, and there are many more universities in Ukraine, if you think about the needs in Ukraine, this picture needs to be different, significantly different. Okay, so I mean, key findings. I want to get to a point where we can actually talk, so I'm not the only one here talking, but it's a problem that over 80% of aid to higher education is in scholarships. So more than 80% of aid to higher education to these 23 countries that have been through conflict never reaches those countries. It helps the individuals, many of whom never go back. And of course, I mean, these are individual choices. I got a scholarship, I left Bosnia, never went back. So, I mean, it's how it works. Aid to higher education, aid to local higher education is not growing. Scholarship aid is growing significantly. But you can't, yeah, I'll get to that. Sorry, I'm rushing. So when we were doing this research and we, we're talking about, the numbers, and so these 23 countries in recent years combined have received something like $115 million for their local higher education. So we wanted to kind of illustrate in our paper, what does that mean? What can you do with that money? Well, it turns out that a university in Canada with 8,000 students has higher operational costs on an annual basis than what donors give to these 23 countries on an annual basis. What can you do to rebuild higher education systems with the money that a small, mid-sized university in Canada spends in a year on salaries and things like that? We're really talking about neglect, incredible neglect. Yeah. I mean, you can see some of the things I'm talking about here. Aid to Ukrainians and Syrians in the literature is linked to, scholarship aid is linked to displacement, refugee crisis, and all that. And that's true. But donors are also very selective which refugee crisis they support through scholarship aid. So many settings, most African countries are completely neglected. Donors can't bother about access, equity, and all kinds of other things in many settings, but they can. But it's also about proximity. It's about who can actually reach Europe, for example. And we need to make them busy. Almost done. Where do we go from here? We talk about this in our research, but we also kind of need to think more. There's a lot of very good literature that speaks about the importance of higher education in any country, and I think we need to do more on emphasizing this in different settings and different spaces among policymakers and all that. We can't let higher education in least developed countries, conflict settings, fragile countries, to be seen as a luxury that these countries don't need higher education. We can just drop a few scholarships so they can go study abroad and maybe never come back and all that. I've done other research also. We looked at the Sustainable Development Goals and their impact on aid to higher education. If you read Sustainable Development Goals carefully, SDG 4, in terms of higher education, specifically in least developed countries, low-income countries, other developing countries, the only target, the only plan is to provide more scholarships for citizens of these countries to study in donor countries. There is no plan, no mention, nothing about supporting local systems and institutions. It's very similar to structural adjustment programs and the things that the World Bank, IMF, and others have done, built on the idea that, for example, poor countries don't need universities. We can just offer a few scholarships. That's been discredited for decades. It came back through the SDGs. I mean, I work with a lot of people who just basically talk about SDGs and implementation of the SDGs, but we don't often look at the problematic nature and the neoliberal nature of the SDGs that we now decided to, that's it, That's what we do. There's some research on decolonizing aid. It's been done primarily by the NGOs. They've seen this as the need, well, a few of them. There isn't enough thinking around this. So if we're thinking about changing ways we support higher education in conflict settings in developing countries, wherever the support and aid are needed, we have to think more about what does this mean and whether the concept of decolonizing aid can help us. There isn't nowhere near sufficient thinking and research around this. We have to question whether anything can change under the capitalist and neoliberal conditions and systems that we exist in. And what does it mean to break this down if it's possible? Well, with the American empire, destroying itself, hopefully, maybe it might be possible, but we have to kind of wait and see where things go. Yeah, you can see where I stand on all that. We have to do more work. We have to do more research. We have to work together and figure out, where do we go? How do we go with this? I'm just rushing through a few of these things. We have to do more research on various things. The good and the bad, and in between of supporting rebuilding higher education. We have to do more on working with people who've been doing, important, successful work that is locally driven in conflict settings. We have to revisit the York Accord and to see, what has been achieved, what were the challenges, what else do we need to include, who else we need to include. I work very closely with Prof. Sultan Barakat, who was one of the leading, one of the people who drove the York Accord, and this is one of the things that I want to try and get him to organize us. By us, I mean the people in all these different spaces that are working on this important subject, and think about universities and higher education and how to rebuild. All this work gets you to a very dark, negative place. I mean, you see the neglect, you see the trends, you see that the neglect is growing further, and you kind of start giving up on hope. Similar to decolonial work in higher education, you just realize that it's all, decolonial washing and all that. We spoke about it earlier today. and sometimes I just look for anything that can actually offer me some hope. Juliet, you know Mario Novelli, you were mentioning him this week throughout the conference. And one of his recent papers gave me that hope. And he says, we have agency, even if that is conditioned, constrained, and facilitated by a range of factors and actors. These constraints often push us towards compliance, policy, service for the powerful, and work against the pursuit of social justice in and through education. And the most important part, we can choose to become implicated in these processes, or we can resist, challenge, and forge alternative paths. And this is really what I think we need to do. We can't give up. I don't think we have the luxury of giving up. I know that that's not the conversation here throughout this whole week. And because we are in higher education, we either do research or we do practical work, we do, all the important things that need to happen. We have to think about what do we need to do, where do we need to push, what research we need to do, and what evidence we can create to challenge policymakers, challenge people and organizations that decide what types of aid are provided. The work that we did, we decided that we need to know the numbers because that might be able to help us to speak on those numbers, because very often people say, well, we don't know what is the situation. We don't know the full picture. We need to work on trying to figure out this full picture on a global scale. And then we need to look at different countries like we did in the case of Palestine. And I'm hoping somebody is interested to collaborate on looking at this in the case of Ukraine and other spaces as well, to really figure out, what we can do. And as Mario Novelli said, we have the agency and that we use it in the best way possible to move forward as this space and this field, and to work towards hopefully something better. Thank you.